Blog Talk Radio.
It's your man, the STL stranger, Umar Lee. I am here in South St. Louis, just west of downtown St. Louis. We down here in Morgan Ford, here in South St. Louis. Caldy's Coffee Shop in Clayton, Richmond Heights. Here on lovely Cherry Street in South St. Louis. A bunch of coffee house in beautiful and lovely Old North St. Louis. Here in the Grove at Rise Coffee. It's a rainy day here in the Del Mar Loop in lovely University City. Here from Midtown St. Louis, corner of West Pine and Vanderbilt at the, what's the name of this place?
Ventana,
yeah. Downtown St. Louis, 1220 Olive, to be specific, at the KMOX headquarters. I'm here in lovely and beautiful Florissant, Missouri, in North St. Louis County. We're here in beautiful and lovely Tower Grove Park in South St. Louis.
you're on.
All right. This is your man, the STL stranger, Umar Lee, joining you for season 2 of the St. Louis Speaks podcast. Hope everybody's been well, and on tonight's episode, we have a very esteemed guest. Is the guest with us yet? Charles?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay. So we're going to be interviewing, that's producer extraordinaire Mark Lohr. We're going to be interviewing Charles Klotzer, who's just a really, one of the most interesting figures to come out of St. Louis in the world of journalism in the 20th century. Has a remarkable history, a remarkable backstory, even before he got to St. Louis, of, living through the Holocaust in Europe and China, going to China and then coming to St. Louis, and all the great history he has in journalism in St. Louis and activism. So it's going to be a real treat to talk to him tonight. Now, of course, while we're waiting on him, we got plenty of other stuff to talk about. I don't know if you got a chance to read the Steve Stenger memos, but I mean, it sounds like a Netflix show. Just all the, this Rex Singenfeld, Stenger. And I would be disappointed if only 2 people go to jail, because it really seems like you have a vast conspiracy going on to privatize the airport, to take control of the city of St. Louis and St. Louis County, the quid pro quo promising Stenger to be the mayor of this new entity. I can't see how Better Together is even still a thing. I saw someone on Twitter yesterday defending it to Purvis Jones. I can't see how Rex is not indicted. Stinger's indicted, Rex should be indicted. And there's a lot of more people that I think need to go to jail. So if these are the only 2 fall guys, 2 or 3 people, I guess it is 3 people, then I think this prosecution is falling short. We definitely have many more people deserving of jail, and I think this investigation needs to continue into the city of St. Louis government, St. Louis County government, Singenfeld, McKee. I think there's a lot of stuff we don't know yet, and I hope this prosecution is not called off early. That's local in St. Louis. Another local St. Louis story this time, of course. The Cardinals got hot. I mean, in Oakland, they lost yesterday, but no help from the front office, but they seem to be turning things around. So that's something we're going to keep our eyes on. Can we keep this St. Louis winning streak continued as we were singing Gloria in St. Louis for the St. Louis Blues victory after 52 long years.
Our guest is here.
All right, our guest is here. I was talking about sports while waiting on Charles. How are you tonight, Mr. Charles Klotzer?
I'm fine, thank you.
Okay, all right. So before
nice weather here.
Well, it's 100 degrees here in Texas right now. Well, it's probably fallen a little bit, but it's very hot down here. So if anyone wants to know what climate change will be like in St. Louis in 20 years, just take a vacation down to Texas in the summertime, and you will find out. So, Charles, before we get started talking about your story, I learned something new about you today that I did not know.
Well, let me know.
That is you were a champion ping pong player. Is this true?
Well, don't forget my age. And yes, I've played it for decades and keeps me sort of from rusting up. But you always, in competitions, play within your age. And there are not many people who play within my age bracket table tennis.
Okay.
So they sort of combine younger years so they have enough people to play there. But
I see.
It's years ago, a doctor said, "What do you do for exercise?" I told him, "I'm very busy." "What are you regularly doing?" he asked. And I had to admit, nothing regular. Pick something up. So I always liked table tennis, but never practiced it, and gradually got involved more and more. And one of my reasons is it may prolong my life a few days by keeping active. So that's one of my motivations, and I sort of enjoy it.
They say you gotta pick up something physically to live longer and to stay active. And I tell you what, Charles, I've lost quite a bit of weight over the last year, and then the doctor said you're adding years onto your life. And then I left the doctor's office and went to the buffet. I said, well, hell, if it's not getting any better than this, I want to keep the weight on.
I keep it up, and it has been useful, in
that's great.
My flexibility and so on.
Where do you play now?
Where I am playing?
Yeah, where do you go to play table tennis?
In the St. Louis area, there are 7 or 8 clubs in table tennis. There are lots of people involved. One is downtown at the community center at 12th and Park. Another one is on St. Charles, and different places at different times,
Okay. I might have to think about that, taking up some table tennis. Now, you were not born in St. Louis, Charles. Where were you born at, for the listeners?
I was born in Berlin, Germany, and the German system at the time didn't care very much for Jews. So in 1939, actually thanks to my mother's, well, she was a very simple woman, with education very limited, so, grade school and so on, she realized what's happening and decided we have to leave. And by 39, we left. But
how old were you at that time?
13.
You were 13. So you have a memory of being born in 1926, I guess. Hitler didn't reach power in the Nazis until 33, I believe. So you have quite a bit of memory for those early years in Germany still? Do you remember what it was like before that?
Sure. As a matter of fact, at that time, Hitler thought if he scares enough Jews, they all will leave. And in Berlin, he arrested in 1937 about 10,000, including my father. And they all ended up in Buchenwald. But at that time, you could be released and get out of the country if you had shipping tickets and could leave. So my mother, while we were not well off, but there were community help, managed to get shipping tickets. So my father was released, but he spent then nearly a year in a hospital to recover from the experience in Buchenwald. And then we left in about April 39 for Shanghai. Nearly the whole world, including the United States, didn't want any refugees from Europe. America, as a matter of fact, instructed all of the embassies not to admit any Jews. So the one we could go to, which was open, no visas, no nothing, was Shanghai, China. So about 20,000 refugees went to Shanghai.
Before we get to Shanghai, I want to ask you a quick question, just real quick.
Sure.
Going back to Germany. In Berlin, were you living in a primarily Jewish neighborhood in Berlin, or was this an integrated neighborhood?
No, very regular. No, I wasn't. It was a regular area, and there wasn't in Berlin a particular Jewish or ghetto or anything of a sort. That was more in Poland and other areas. I do not know of any particular area. There may have been some. Like right now in St. Louis, there is no ghetto. But on the West End, there are many more Jews. Well, some live in South St. Louis, but they're more in the West End, you know.
Yes.
It was this kind of situation.
And of course, for the Orthodox, they need to be close to the synagogue to walk, and so they cluster around the synagogue.
Well, there were many of them around. There were quite a few temples and synagogues around, you know. So I was 13, so I wasn't quite aware where the populations were.
Right. Did you have your bar mitzvah in Germany?
We lived on a second floor on what's called Riedersdorfer Straße, which when we visited Germany again, at a later time, the German government invited us, apologized what happened, and so on. But so my mother, father, and myself visited Germany later on. But the area we lived was all gone, apparently bombed out, and looked different, you know. And the period in which we lived in Shanghai was from roughly 39 to the end of 47.
47.
Before the Red Army took over Shanghai.
And this was a very international city at the time, right? A lot of people had come to Shanghai, if I'm not mistaken.
I didn't quite hear you. About 20,000 went to Shanghai.
20,000, but there was also a lot of Europeans, other Europeans in Shanghai at the time.
Oh, yes. Heavily Jewish, but there were others too, because those people who fled there, you know, to Shanghai, one of the secretaries of state, the U.S. under Carter, was Blumenthal, his name, and he was actually a Shanghai refugee too. And one of the reunions, the Shanghai refugees had many reunions in the States because they formed sort of a close bond. And at one of the reunions, Blumenthal gave a detailed speech what happened within the U.S. government to stop all refugees coming here. Wasn't unlike some of the aspects of today, you know.
Yes.
And of course later it changed.
What was life like in Shanghai? Was life comfortable there, or was it a struggle in Shanghai, or? It
depends. Some people who managed to get some of their values out lived comfortable and managed to establish some businesses. But most of them, like my parents, you were permitted to have 10 mark when you left. And on the way on the train to Italy and Genoa, where we boarded an ocean liner to go to Shanghai, we bought hot dogs all the way along. My parents were scared to have any money. And when we came to the border, Gestapo, that means secret U.S. the German investigative officers came and asked everybody, what do you have, etc. My parents said, we don't have any money. No, how can you exist somewhere else? There'll be hope some people will help us, which did later. But what was interesting, then the train went over the borders and Italian gendarmes came up. Their first words were, you all relax. You're in Italy now. You're not anymore in Germany, and keep on smiling and so on. This was already under Mussolini, the fascist.
Right.
But it was a fascinating experience crossing the border into Italy.
Now,
in Shanghai itself, my parents were relatively old, couldn't find any job. I was 13. The refugees, most of them pretty educated, the first thing they did there is form a school, grade school and high school. And I went to a high school there, which was also partly financed by a Jewish community who had been there for several generations. Many of them came from India. They're kind of a merchandise class who had lived there and was relatively well off, some extremely well off. Their names were Kaduri and Sassoon, typical names for this part of the world. And they partly helped the refugees coming there. And I went through a high school. Originally, we lived in camps, kind of. By camps, I mean, when we first got there, they were just they weren't individual homes, but just the men and women somewhere else and children. But very soon, my parents moved out because they received $150. $150 was enough money for a family to live on for 2 years.
2 years?
Yeah. And they moved out and in an apartment, and then ultimately when the money ran out, we moved back into a kind of, you would call it nowadays public housing, but was organized by Jewish community.
Organized by the Shanghai Jewish community or American Jewish organization?
By the Jewish, but primarily by money which came in through Switzerland to the Jewish community in Shanghai. That became more difficult. I know I'm jumping around, but you have so many interesting questions. After the Pacific War started, the money stopped coming in. It became more difficult to support all the refugees. The head of the American Jewish Joint Distribution stayed in Shanghai in spite of the war. He visited the top Japanese official in Shanghai and said, you are faced with two alternatives. One of them, you permit American money to come in through Switzerland, which I can use to feed the refugees. Or you don't permit it. Ultimately, there will be riots in all the refugees, and you don't want any riots by people in this area. He agreed and permitted money to come in through Switzerland. It's one of the interesting side stories.
Yes.
there's another
now,
aspect. Go ahead.
This organized community in Shanghai, did it? How deeply was communal life set up? Were there, were you able to observe Jewish holidays in Shanghai?
It might interest you to know that during those years, there were 2 weekly and 3 daily newspapers, some in German, some in English. My father was also an actor. There were theaters. There was a symphony. There was a very cultural life. As a matter of fact, they rebuilt part of Shanghai, which some people said looked like a Vietnamese city, not Vietnamese, Vienna, Austrian city. Mm-hmm. And it had a very active cultural life. That doesn't mean it was easy. Many people there most of them were very poor, and the community kitchen, which again the organization created, enabled people to have at least one solid meal a day. You could buy other things, of course. I myself, after I got through high school, worked for a refugees who had a little paint factory. Till the end of the war, I worked there, and he paid me $3 US a month. And the war was over, and American soldiers came in, and I applied, and I became working in supervising a warehouse for the American soldiers, and I got $80 a month, which was a fortune. Well, now, that gives you a very long answer to a simple question.
Yeah, right. Well, it's okay. Now, in Shanghai, I have a couple of questions. Number one, were you getting word in Shanghai about what was going on in Europe, or what was going on in Germany with the Jewish population in Poland and Ukraine and Lithuania, other places?
No, partly, yeah. Mm-hmm. Not really. Remember that the Russians didn't fight the Japanese to the very end. So we knew what was happening on the Eastern Front, because Russia had news outlets in Shanghai. They were not at war with the Japanese at the time. But we knew nothing what really happened in Germany. The moment it was over, we tried to contact our relatives, and we got back mail and letters which said, cannot be found, or something of the sort. One cousin of mine survived Auschwitz. I heard from him a year after the end of the war. He died. And before we heard, there were some experiments done on him, but I don't have any details at all. Everybody else, quite a few relatives we had disappeared, including an uncle of mine, where we heard from others. He went to the concentration camp in Theresienstadt and apparently died there, whatever you can call it, a more normal death. But we had no information what happened in Germany itself, except for whatever the Russians, military news. We were aware of what happened there.
But was there the sense that something very bad was going on in Europe? That that there was
our assumption was obviously very fearful, but we had no details. We didn't know anything, That I know that some of my relatives, before the war started in 1939, sent us a letter, can you help us getting out of here? And we tried, but we couldn't. By that time, there were so many refugees coming to Shanghai that the Japanese stopped the immigration. The reason we could easily get to Shanghai, it goes back in history. After the Boxer Revolt by Chinese 200 years ago, they were, and the Western powers took away Hong Kong and other enclaves. There were also French and British settlements in Shanghai, where British law and French law existed. It was like foreign countries. And the Japanese, which had invaded the rest of Shanghai, but not the French and British settlements, because they weren't at war then. After 42, they occupied those areas too. Before then, Shanghai was ruled by a consortium of some Western powers, French, British, I think American, Chinese, and Japanese, who ruled Shanghai. But the Western powers didn't want the Japanese to have any say-so who came and went. So they abolished all visas, no entry permit, and that's why we could get to Shanghai. We literally went off the boat, nobody said anything, and there we were. And 20,000 other refugees also fled there. There's another misconception. Americans very often think that World War II started in 42 with the Japanese attack. Europeans assume it's 39 when Germany invaded Poland. But the war actually started in 32 when Japan conquered Manchuria and renamed it Manchukuo. And then for a while they stopped and then they started again. So there were wartime activities going back to 32. You know, depending what your background is, different perceptions.
Well, Americans always have a narcissistic view of history. There's a great book, The Rape of Nanking, by Iris Chang, about the Japanese, atrocities in China. But Americans
about it.
Americans, they think of the First World War.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The general consensus is that in Nanking, when they finally came in, they killed about 300,000 people there, most of them civilians, not only the army. And they were utterly brutal. But there are exceptions. Again, I'm just talking from personal experience. There was a Japanese officer. He was intrigued by the Jewish community because, if you recall the Bolshevik revolution, many, they were called white Russians, had fled into Harbin and China, and these were very anti-Semitic. And their chieftain, I forgot his name, got a hold of a book called The Protocols of Zion or something, which explained that Jewish money controls the rest of the world. And he had all the soldiers read it. A Japanese officer high in the intelligence community in Shanghai got a hold of this book, read it, and said, that's fascinating. If these people are so powerful, I'd like to meet them. He went into Harbin and later Shanghai, studied it, learned perfect Hebrew, interviewed that time Weizmann and Ben-Gurion, and said, this book doesn't quite make sense. what you learned about the Jewish people was different, the book said. And he became close to the Jewish community in Shanghai. Let me jump way ahead.
Okay.
The butcher of Warsaw, the Nazi official who destroyed the city in Poland, was sent by Germany to Shanghai to convince the Japanese to hire 2 ocean liners, put all the Jews on board and sink them. That particular Japanese official went to Tokyo and told them, as Japanese, we make our own decisions. We shouldn't follow orders from anybody else. And that plan
so listeners
was never carried out.
Just so listeners can understand this, the Nazis, German, were requesting the Japanese to round up the Jews of Shanghai and put them in ships and sink them. Is that correct?
Right. As a matter of fact, earlier they had pressured the Japanese to create sort of a ghetto in Shanghai, which was only guarded by refugees themselves. As you know St. Louis, don't you? Very well. If it, let's say, anything between Page and Delmar and Kings Highway and Skinker, that's a ghetto. Anybody else could live there too. But all the Jews, they never said Jews. They never considered religion. We were always called stateless refugees, have to move in there. And many of the refugees have already homes outside. So they exchanged it with people who had homes within that ghetto area and exchanged it. But the Japanese issued a proclamation. Anybody who takes advantage of the movement of refugees into it will be severely punished. That all has to be honest trades, which surprised everybody very much. And from about 42, the war started. About 43 to the end of the war, everybody had to live within that ghetto area. We already lived in that area, so we didn't have to move. And that area was called Hongqiu. Again, a long answer to a simple question.
Well, so you're 19 when the war is ending, and you know you've been uprooted. Your family is leaving Germany as refugees. You're surrounded by other refugees and stateless people in Shanghai. What kind of a future did you see for yourself in 45? What kind of did you think?
Actually, I always liked to write way before then. When I was leaving, I was already, it was 47. I was born 25. I was about 22.
Okay.
So we settled in St. Louis. Well, first we landed in San Francisco.
Okay,
and we loved that city.
How did you get a visa to come to America?
How we did it? That time, American organization provided affidavits, which the organization guaranteed that we would not be coming to depend on American government welfare or anything else. Mm-hmm. So it was Jewish organizations which provided the financial support and affidavits about 6,000 came to the state, another 6,000 roughly went to Israel and also to other countries, all over.
Right, because at this period there were basically 3 options for Jews. There was British Mandate Palestine at the time, before statehood in 48. There was North America, and then there was...
we applied everywhere to get out of Shanghai. But at that time, England did not permit anybody to go to what's now called Israel. You know, the British, they're not friendly to additional support coming. And, you know, there was no possibility getting to Palestine, which was called then, you know.
Right.
So whatever came through first, we would have accepted. Some people went to Australia. Some people went to various Latin American countries.
Or Argentina.
1 second, please.
Mm-hmm.
And some people went to various countries. And of course, I at that time worked for the Joint Distribution Committee, and which was the key support base. Back in Shanghai, I had also attended, after the war, a Chinese business college. I learned shorthand, typing, bookkeeping, and so on, which was very useful coming here, more so later than originally. I worked for a local company. We had no computers at the time, and figured out Social Security and other taxes for 300 people every week. I got a headache doing it. So I put an ad in the postal dispatch. At the time, I didn't know that you had to have a degree to work in journalism. Because obviously I didn't. I just came here. And a young guy responded from a small newspaper in Troy, Illinois. Do you know who Paul Simon was?
Sure. A former United States Senator and presidential candidate.
Yeah.
Famous
He was
for the bow tie.
19. He was 19, just had taken over the Troy, Illinois newspaper because I think the editor at that time. I met him for a cup of coffee downtown. I told him about
Peoria.
my day. I'm sorry?
In downtown Peoria.
No, in downtown St. Louis. He was in Troy, Illinois. Yeah.
Okay, he's in Troy, yeah.
Yeah, met with him. I told him my views, which were very leftist, liberal. And he said, "Oh, I love it. Great." And I told him, "But I'm Jewish." He said, "Great, too. We have no Jews in Troy, Illinois. They all come to look at you." And they did. And for 2 years I started my career as an assistant editor. I didn't go up through the ranks. Meanwhile, I also went to college at night at Washington U. And after 2 years, Paul was drafted during the Korean episode, and so was I. And we stayed friends the rest of our lives.
You say you were drafted in the Korean War?
I was in it was 20, it was 51, I think, to 53.
And did you serve?
Yeah.
Did you serve in the armed forces?
No. I first training in Fort Leonard Wood. Then they sent me to Fort Bliss, Texas, El Paso. And they wanted me to work, if I wanted to, on the local base newspaper. Or there was a local chaplain, Rabbi Skolnick. You probably heard of it, a branch of Judaism called Reconstructionism. Reconstructionist Judaism, which is
a progressive branch, yes.
Yeah, which is very liberal and etc. And I decided I could goof up much more being a chaplain's assistant than being on a newspaper. So I joined him and went every night to El Paso, Texas College. And I got about a year's worth of credits there. So after I was released 52 and in 53, then I got married to my wife.
In Texas or in St. Louis?
In St. Louis.
Did you meet?
I got out of the army early in 53, and after about 66 years, she passed away this March. And Rose had a master's in social work, and I got enough credits after my bachelor's. I skipped my master's. I wanted to go right on my political science PhD, but the professor, Merle Kling, also a friend of mine, said, Charles, if you don't stay in school, you get active in life, you'll never finish it. And he was right. And I never finished it. I got too many things going.
I can co-sign to that. How did you meet your wife, Charles?
Whom did I meet?
How did you meet your wife? How did you two meet?
Oh, we were at a student group called Hilo. And after I met her
for people who don't know,
Hilo is a Jewish student organization. Group. Yeah.
Yes. Mm.
And after 2 months meeting her, I proposed to get married. She said,
you got right down to business.
They didn't say, are you not? What? Well, I knew what I wanted. Yes. And she said, I want to go to college and finish college and so on. So we didn't see each other for quite a while. Meanwhile, I worked for Paul Simon, and if you know anything about Illinois, it was dominated by very crooked officials, by gangsters. Waltman built a mansion. There's a moat around it so nobody could kill him, one of the gangsters. And Paul made his name really by exposing corruption there. At one time, he asked me to go one of those gambling places, which were officially illegal but very open, and said, I want you to cover it and write a story. And I did. And as I was there, somebody tapped on my shoulder and said, are you still there? Are you there? Yeah.
Yes,
I hear
I'm
beeping. Okay,
oh, no, I'm here.
It's somebody trying to call me. Somebody tapped on my shoulder and said, anybody who has his hands in his pockets around here isn't gambling. So his idea was get the hell out of here. So at time, a bunch of students met at the corner of Union and Delma because YMHA was very close on Union, near that. Nowadays it's a police station, I think.
Which was Young Men's Hebrew Association, which is now the West End Community Center. Demetrius Johnson
but there were both women and men there, you know. And we met for a cup of coffee, and we talked about it. And I told them about my experience being kicked out of a gambling joint, and they had told me we have only couples here and so on. Well, Rose was there too, and I see somebody else to come along with me. Knowing Rose, she would say, oh, that sounds interesting, I come. So we started dating again.
There you go.
Yeah, and well, the rest of the story, she actually worked for a while as a social worker, and she always said she made a mistake of learning how to type, because when I started publishing some of the journals, she joined me, helped in some of the typing, and gradually for the next 30 or more years worked with me on publishing the stuff which I did.
Well, it's quite a history, 66 years. So you leave the paper in Illinois at what point and come into St. Louis? What year was that, Charles? And what was the was the media climate like in St. Louis at that time?
Well, obviously, I was working for Paul from about. I got married in '53, and I had worked for Paul, I think, from about 51 to about 53 for 2 years.
Okay.
And then I was drafted, and Paul was drafted too. He applied for that time called the counterintelligence, not CIA, was called counterintelligence Corps or something, CIA, and he was accepted. I applied for it too, but I wasn't a citizen then. I said, no, sorry,
okay.
You passed, but you can't join it. So
I see.
But I stayed sort of in touch with him. And when we say sort of friends, not that we saw each other very often. He went on his political career. But in '85, if I'm right, he was trying to run for president. At
84.
the time,
I believe was 88, 84 or 88. I think 88. He was trying to run.
Well, it was in the 80s. It's the same year
right.
when Representative Gephardt was running for president.
Yeah, 88. That was 1988.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So no Missouri politician could support Paul, but the whole community in St. Louis considered Paul as their senator. And so Paul came and said, I have somebody to represent me in Missouri. And one of them is to get on the ballot. I think they had to get 25 people who gave $500 each for his campaign. And he asked me to do it, and I got many more than 25 people. And later on he said, I need somebody to run my campaign in Missouri. I said, I'm publishing. I can't do that. Well, you can do it anyhow. I didn't use my papers for him at all, but I ran his campaign in
So
Missouri.
you ran the Missouri Paul Simon presidential campaign in '88.
Yeah.
And how did Paul Simon do?
I ran a few other campaigns that shows you how effective I was. You remember Atlee Stevenson?
Yeah, I mean,
from
Illinois. I read
Illinois.
about him. Yes.
Yeah, he was an amazing person. I ran his campaign, and later on, then under Johnson and Humphrey, there was McCarthy running, and
right.
I was sort of running his campaign too.
Gene.
Obviously, they picked the wrong person to run their campaigns because.
Yeah. Did anybody win that you ran their campaign, Charles, or was it all? Did you get any victories?
Well, we had a wonderful time, but Stevenson or Simon or McCarthy, none of them got anywhere. You know that.
Yeah,
you know.
Right.
So on. Yeah. But I was involved with what's called the New Democratic Coalition, others, to upset the establishment in this area. And in a limited way, we were successful on a local level, like that time running, there was, he just got out of it, local attorney general or county attorney general, and some other people, on a local level. Some of them, part of these efforts were successful. But it was interesting becoming involved in many of these things, you know.
Right. Let's talk about your publishing career in St. Louis, because you founded publications, you've written for publications. What was your first foray into St. Louis publishing and journalism?
Well, one of them, the first one was, that time there were no free newspapers in Missouri.
Okay.
And they were advertising things for the newspapers. I felt the Jewish community is pretty well off, and I got a hold of various mailing lists, put out a free newspaper called the Jewish Star, which was a regular newspaper. We tried to get advertising very little on a weekly basis. And that let's see what came first. And that newspaper had deficits because I didn't have lots of support. And then the Federation contacted me. You seem to be so successful what you're doing. Why don't you become Director of Public Relations for the Jewish Federation and publish the Jewish Light? Well, having debts, having difficulties, my wife was just getting her master's. She was also, for a while, was sick there. It was very attractive. They also paid off all my debts. So I stopped the Star and added the Jewish Light.
Well, let's talk about the Star for a second, because what years did you publish the Star, and what kind of content was the Star known for? What was the big issues that you covered?
Well, I should look at it. I have some right in my basement here. But you see, let me go backwards. That must have been in the late 50s.
Okay.
What I didn't realize that the Federation, never mind that the intent was, and that result was that they stopped an independent Jewish voice in this area. Because I was very critical of various things. What happened? As all my
what were you critical of?
Well, whenever you publish something, there never was any evaluation or criticism of any system. There was enough to criticize, individuals or people or whatever it was. And so by offering me that job and that position, reasonably well paid off, obviously, it stopped an independent voice. After 1 year, I stopped working there because it was too simplistic, the whole approach. For example, I collected all the activities in this area of interest to Jewish community. And the executive director at this time, by the way, it's very different paper now. It's much more independent, does many other things. But that executive director federation, who had to read everything what I wrote, crossed out many of the people I had on my list of activities. I said, no, I talked to them. He said they're neither supporters of the Federation campaign nor are they beneficiaries. we have no link to them. And that was one among many other things what happened. It was a private organization. They're entitled to do it, but I wouldn't have to work there, And I quit it. Then
because at the store,
I found a job.
If I'm not mistaken,
I'm sorry.
At the store, if I'm not mistaken, you were doing some interesting stories. I think there was a story where you covered African Americans not being admitted into rec centers. You were covering issues that were deemed very controversial at the time. This is getting into the era of the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
Was that something that ruffled some feathers locally?
Yeah, yes, I think so. I can't give you any specific stories now. I have to read it, some of the issues. But there were stories in there which obviously some people in the establishment didn't feel, didn't care for them. But when I quit it for about a number of years looking for a job, I worked for a local construction company, running the personnel and other things. And then after 5 years, it was 5 years I was there. This company then had real difficulties. Now it was bought by other people and apparently is doing quite well. And after I quit there, for a while I looked around and discussed my idea with my wife. What about publishing a local magazine? I didn't see anything really covering issues locally or even on a broader base, which would cover social, racial, or other issues. And typically, when you talk to somebody from the South, they say, I'm from the South, I'm from New England, people would never say, I'm from the Midwest. The name Midwest is not really complimentary to many people. So I thought I confronted head on and called the magazine Focus Midwest to give some support to the connotations of Midwest. And in the first issue we had, that time we was either Supreme Court Justice or part of the cabinet here by Arthur Goldberg and others. A little bit later, Hubert Humphrey became a columnist for me, and we covered social and other issues. You may have, thanks to Mark River, you may have seen some of the issues.
I have,
and,
yes.
Yeah.
And you had some very notable people writing for you and covering some serious thought throughout the Midwest. I don't think many people today may not realize that.
Yeah, if you read some of the issues, there doesn't seem much difference what's covered about Ferguson now, or 50 years, or it covered this till 83. That means 50, 60, or 70 years ago. The same issue, we had issue on police, on the kind of coverage of social, racial, and cultural issues, which are very prominent now. For example, one of the issues we had, the arch downtown in St. Louis was supposed to be in support of workers and laborers during the Depression. And I forgot who the mayor was. I think it was with a D something. He called the city officials together and said, this is on the ballot. they didn't call it the Arch now, a monument downtown which will distinguish this area. And this one has to pass. Well, the vote was cast, and for 2 days the votes disappeared. Then they were counted, and it passed.
Sounds pretty
And that's
St.
the
Louis.
beginning. That's the beginning of the arch, the gateway to the west we have now.
Right.
And these are kind of issues we publish, or we published some other issues. We always had a veiled prophet event here, where the established men crowned one of their daughters or somebody as
Right.
the distinguished mark of the veiled prophet and so on. Well, we revealed that the 19...
Just to back up, so some listeners may not know, the veiled prophet, ball is where the elites of the city of St. Louis area get together, and they have a debutante ball every year, which is one of the daughters of these local shot callers, millionaires, etc.
But I think it was 1926 when that debutante was pregnant outside marriage, so her picture was deleted for all references and wasn't available, but we had lots of fun talking about it, in the issue.
Right.
So obviously some people liked what you wrote, and I'm sure others didn't. As a matter of fact, we were denounced as a leftist, and I don't know what publication. Somebody wrote to, I think it was the head of the FBI was Herbert Hoover, and he wrote a letter back and saying there are distinguished people working for it, and that's a legitimate publication. I got a hold of it because I requested under the open records law anything which was, there, which was very interesting. So we were kosher in there. And later on, you mentioned publications. You know what happened in 1968? Democratic Convention.
Yeah. That's one of my favorite books, Norman Mailer, Miami and the Seas of Chicago, about the conventions in Chicago and Miami.
Yeah. Well, there were an army of young students confronting the Democratic establishment, and Mayor Daley organized an army of police officers, and the two fought each other on the streets of Chicago. Well, the newspapers reported it was a student riot. The reporters, who were themselves beaten up, knew it wasn't a student riot, it was a police riot. So they brought out the Chicago Journalism Review, which these were people working on the paper, that our newspapers are lying about what happened. Well, I got in the mail some of the issues of Chicago Journalism Review. That time it was Ron Dolphman was one of the key people to organize it. And I called together Post-Dispatch, Globe, and other people working for the media here and said to the same thing. Let's publish the St. Louis Journalism Review. And the first issue came out in September of 1970. And as I was getting older, I wanted to keep it alive. I looked around because small publications always need financial support. And it never even broke even. So the Journalism Review for a while was taken over at Webster University. After 10 years, they said we can't afford it anymore, which was kind of silly for a university. Their support was minimal. So it came back into my lap for a few years, but then I found that many editors, reporters from the Post, the Globe meanwhile had closed, had transferred to SIU in Carbondale. And I talked to them. Again, it took a lot of effort and maneuvering. SIU Carbondale now publishes called the Gateway Journalism Review, as well it's also called St. Louis Journalism Review, because some people wanted to have the new name and old name. And it's being published partly in print, but also on a weekly basis, which anybody can free of charge by calling up on the website the Gateway Journalism Review, and you get weekly news, local as well as national, which we probably may not find in other publications.
The St. Louis Journalism Review, you know, when it came out, St. Louis was a two-paper town. You had the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and the St. Louis Globe Democrat. Obviously, the Globe Democrat had a very conservative line, editorial board supporting Nixon, later supporting Reagan, had a very harsh stance towards anti-Vietnam War protesters. The Post-Dispatch, though, was, fairly conservative in its own right, if, on the Democratic side of the aisle, but very much seen as not challenging the status quo in St. Louis that much. So how did the St. Louis Journalism Review call to task these publications when they needed to?
Well, as a matter of fact, in the beginnings, I had people who worked both on the Globe and the Post write stories about the Globe and the Post. Both the Globe and Post weren't very happy about it. As a matter of fact, one of them, Gus Lumpy, his wife was a state rep. He was for a while the education editor. Then he was assigned, just I think, to write obituaries, because I suspected him to working with me, and they were right, he did. And later there was one criminal story which he failed to cover, and they wanted to dismiss him. The newspaper guild took up his case, and then the Globe offered him a lot of money to quit, and there was not enough money for him to turn down, and he did. There was another Globe reporter who, in the very beginning, was part of it. And then Killenberg, the editor, kept visiting him whenever there was a Globe story in the paper. Did you work with him again? And he didn't anymore. He wanted to keep his job. The Post was different. Klotzer kept meetings in his home of key reporters and editors. And as one of them I know, he asked, anybody from the Journalism Review here? And Lou Rose and Roy Malone, both of them have passed away. And somebody else, I forgot who, they raised up their hands. And he sort of smiled and went on with his meeting. So quite a while in the beginning, we decided not to use any bylines whatsoever to protect the reporters and have legitimate stories. I knew who all they were, and I could check it out, and others checked it out. But as years went by, there was too much dissatisfaction with the articles not having bylines. And we then decided to change. We started using some people not necessarily working for the Post or Globe. And the Post people still pretended to be a little paper and didn't ever really react strongly. They may have criticized people for covering things, but the Globe was quite difficult, you know. The Globe wanted to bomb Nicaragua under Duncan, Marty Dugan, and Bauman, the publisher, and it's that much more difficult. As a matter of fact, I always regretted that when the Globe of Bauman threatened us with a libel suit, we had taken about 14 or 15 pictures of the Globe published within a 2-week period of Bauman, the publisher, in his own paper. He collected all of them, put them together, and said, I don't know what we really said, but we put them all on one page. And Bauman, the publisher, wrote us a letter, we are offending the copyright law and so on, which is nonsense. And that time my attorney was Louis Green. You may have heard of him. He started sort of the environmental group, Great Rivers, and was very active in liberal and environmental sources. He said, let me meet with them. I said, oh, no, I need a lawsuit. I need the publicity. It would be great. No, he said, let me meet with him. So he met and came back. Well, if you are sure you'll never again collect 18 papers of him on one page, he'll be satisfied. So to appease Green and Lou more than anything, I agreed to it. But I still feel it would have been nice to be sued by Bauman for publishing 15 or 16 of his papers on one page at one time.
So I can't imagine you were that popular around the editors and the big shots at the local papers at the time. You had to be kind of a controversial character in the St. Louis journalism scene at that time.
Well, not at the Globe, obviously. At the Post, there was a mixed feeling. Some of them felt that some people didn't enough research or not accurate enough sometimes. But I think people at the Post were more ambivalent because in principle, I think they enjoyed having this voice. As a matter of fact, the Post had editorials. When I published the Focus Midwest, Irving Dilliard was the editor of the Post. Every month they reprinted one of my articles. Of course, that time I didn't take on the papers as such. So it wasn't quite different. Later, when I started Journalism Review, usually at year end, there were sort of some kind of evaluation what's happening. And it was at least several times they said, yeah, among people who keep us to account is the Riverfront Times and the Journalism Review. You know, it was like a compliment. As a matter of fact, last year, the Post had a lot of mention of different things happening. Again, mentioned only one small paragraph where they mentioned Riverfront Times and at that time the Globe, the Gateway Journalism Review and others as keeping them to account. So kind of a little bit of charity and extending, compliments and doing it. Personally, no, I wasn't necessarily very popular. One funny article was I was with my family in the Ozarks, came back and bought a Globe Democrat on the way back. And right on the front page is a big article with my picture. earlier, one of the reporter for this kind of work, her name was S.H. something. I became the mastermind, the head of all anti-Vietnam activities here, of all protests, whatever happened here, because they all had links to me. Well, the links were factual. I had published some of their articles. I had interviewed some, but I felt so embarrassed. I apologized to some of the real leaders. I wasn't the organizer. It was so complimentary for the community I lived in that I was called the head of all these things. You know, it wasn't factual at all. I mean, I happened to know them all.
Did that ever make you a target for authorities, or did you ever feel like you were a target due to the Vietnam War?
No, none at all. No, none of it. I was never under any pressure or anything of the sort. No, I led a very quiet life with my 3 children, my wife, and while I knew things, and we were trying to be careful because there are lots of stories out there which were factual, you know, and we tried to do the research, and we had people who were very highly qualified as assistant editors, like Ed Bishop, when we were at Webster University. He became the editor for about 10 years, did a good job. Earlier in the beginning, you may have heard of Roland Close. Roland.
I don't think I remember that one.
Yeah, Roland had a career outside, I think it was Memphis, as business editor. Then he was brought to St. Louis as the business editor of the Post-Dispatch. And now is another position there. For many years, he did a hell of a job for me. For example, when the Globe and Post consolidated, and it's called the joint, what was it called? The newspapers had only a joint arrangement, and the Globe and the Post joint have the same advertising department, everything the same, except the news was independent. And and when we're closed, that time Roland revealed that the Globe had more of a circulation than the Post, and many reasons which were never publicized by the joining of both papers to the Post. And was it Newmark, who was the owner of the Globe, got a terrific amount of money. And even when Lee Enterprise bought the Post-Dispatch, part of the sale, he got $300 million to get out of it, to relieve his part. And even then, he left $5 million in there. And I assume by now he got that out. But the whole operation of closing the papers, joint operating, JOA, called Joint Operating Agency, was started under President Nixon. And that time, a law was passed in Congress, which was It was originally called, I think, the Failing Newspaper Act or something. Newspapers didn't like the name and renamed it the Newspaper Preservation Act or something of the sort. They changed the name, and which was passed permitting, in a way, monopolies in an area. And most of the joint operating agencies, I think by now,
this was passed in order to prevent newspaper monopolies and the kind of media monopolies we've seen increasingly become a reality in this country today via the internet and TV and radio station
like
ownership.
in St. Louis, we have one newspaper now.
Right.
And that happened all over the country.
And a handful of companies that own most of the TV and radio stations.
Yeah. Am I taking up too much of your time?
No, not at all. Not at all. I actually have a couple of big things I want to ask you about as well.
Sure.
Number one is, I know that at Focus you had a column where you tracked local right-wingers, local hate groups who had been quite active. Of course, we know James Earl Ray came out of the St. Louis Metro. We know many other bad actors, came out of this area. Tell us a little bit about that column.
Well, we had a column in every issue in Focus Midwest, which was called Right Wing, which dealt with local situations. For example, there was a school board election, and people, some in South St. Louis, I don't remember the name, who had belonged to the KKK earlier, and some of them were elected on the local school board. Also, there was a local Cardinal Mindszenty Foundation, and Eleanor Schlafly over there, which formed, I think, the Moral Majority group, was active.
Phyllis Schlafly, I believe, yeah.
And then there was the Birch Society in this area. And there were, however, at that time, many of things we reported on were really part of the fringe area. Nowadays, they have moved into public acceptance much more. What's now prevalent, what some people on the right talking about, was earlier considered generally unacceptable. Now much of it has become acceptable and has changed. Our coverage of the right wing, we had this regular column. There was things happening in this area, racially and politically, but it wasn't in the mainstream. Some people were prominent in it, but now it's less by leaders who are there, but I feel it's much more diffused and infiltrated among generally called populism or whatever you want to call it, including our president. And that would have been considered unacceptable, 20, 30 years ago. So we covered this on a regular basis, and always trying to concentrate on local people or local activities, in doing it.
Now, I want to ask you to take the long view in closing, because you're born in Germany. You're a little boy in Germany, I assume, playing like little kids do. You have your neighbors, you have your friends, you have your schoolmates.
No.
Then
It wasn't
political.
like that.
Well, I
No.
mean, you were a little boy.
Yes, I was a little kid,
Yeah.
but I didn't plan
Yeah.
for namers because they called me
didn't?
names. I had one. No, I had one person who I played with, and I remember we were in the hallmark playing something, and I told them, "You probably won't come back again." And the other party said, "Why not?" I told them, "I'm Jewish." And the party said, "Well, I am too." so downstairs where we lived was a cigarette shop. My father at that time was a heavy smoker, and he bought a cigarette there. And the owner came, "Mr. Klotzer, my apologies. We have dealt such a long time together. Why don't you buy your cigarette somewhere else who don't know you? I don't mind at all that you come here, but I don't want to be selling cigarettes to a Jew."
So wow,
the atmosphere
yeah.
that I was playing with neighbors, I never was.
So you were bullied in school, or bullied by the neighbor kids as a child?
Well, another incident. I must have been 7 or 8. I went to a general school, and by 8 it was 33. And suddenly all the other classmates of mine moved away, and I was sitting alone. And the teacher came in. He was gray-haired, very nice guy. He said, "What's going on over there?" And they said, my first name was Lothar at this time. Now it's my middle initial. They said, "He stinks." And he knew what was going on. And he thundered, "This will not happen in my class." Anybody, but whatever he said, he didn't let it pass.
Right.
When my parents heard it, they later transferred me to a Jewish general school. So it was as early as 33 or 34 that the atmosphere had already changed.
How was the
Okay,
atmosphere
sorry,
at the
I
Jewish
interrupted
school?
you.
Yeah. How was the atmosphere at the Jewish school compared to the other school? Were you able to make more friends there? Or able to have more of a?
I played soccer a lot. We played school. It was very normal school. There was no feeling of fear of what's happening. My parents sort of insulated me in many ways, so I wouldn't. I knew and I didn't know what was going on. But the upbringing in the first in the regular school, later was a middle school called Große Hamburger Straße. It's still there and still a school, and was like a normal school.
So what I was going to say is
interrupting you.
Yeah, I was going to say is this life that began in Germany. Now you just explained it was bullying in your childhood, and this obviously was the backdrop is Nazi Germany, and the Holocaust is around the corner, and then you go to China, and then you make it to San Francisco, and eventually to St. Louis. You've seen a lot. You've experienced a lot. You've had epic historical events intervene with your life, the Second World War and all of the atrocities associated with it, and many more. You lived through the Vietnam War, the protest movement, the various political trends in America. And I want to ask you today, we see the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump. We see what happened in El Paso, Texas, just yesterday. We see the political climate in America today. Does this remind you of any periods in your life? Does it remind you of any previous political climates? And are there any lessons from the past that we could learn to help us address our situation today?
Well, is, of course, a big question. Books can be written about it, but I consider Trump as an aberration. There's something basic in American life. Americans have a religion, and their religion is the Constitution. Even way on the left, way on the right, or in between, everybody claims that their position is represented by the Constitution. The fear I have that this bedrock sustenance for American life, American culture, American politics may be jeopardized if Trump is reelected and one or two more justices resign or die or something. That's my fear in the long run. The Supreme Court, even some who were appointed, considered conservative, came liberal, and even now the chief of the Supreme Court considered a conservative by took number of times liberal, considered liberal position. But if you have two more Trump-appointed Supreme Court justices, the Constitution, which everybody claims to represent the best in American life, may not be enough bedrock support for what American life usually represents. That's my fear. Generally, I'm always an optimist. My father always said everything will turn out to the best. I inherited this. But the way it's now moving, and I can't see that he will be reelected, but who knows?
Right.
If he is reelected,
we don't know. We don't know.
We don't know.
Right.
That the nationalist and populist, or whatever you want to call it, this element in our society, the underbelly, which every society has, will become even more popular because it rewards people who are part of this underbelly. And that's really my long-term fear. I'm still convinced that the American public, who has gone, remember the riots and the racial riots we had, and the Ku Klux Klan marched in the streets, etc. It overcame many of these things. But nowadays, there's another threat. I'm still optimistic that the ability to see beyond the performances, beyond the photo ops, that they'll be able to discern what's going on behind, So I remain an optimist.
Yeah. Well, I wish I could remain an optimist, but I'm very concerned with these levels of violence that, Christchurch and then El Paso and the Pittsburgh.
Yeah, you're right. You cannot
shooting.
three violence in a few days, and it's unbelievable.
It's unbelievable, and there has been. Obviously, everybody likes to go to the Nazi analogy and World War II, but in the Holocaust. But there's been so many. I just finished reading a book on the Armenian genocide. Where over 1 million Armenians were killed by the Ottoman Turks, and so many other times, if you read the manifesto of the El Paso shooter, he's speaking of Hispanics as an infection to the state of Texas, as attempting a takeover. And that's the exact same language that was spoken of about the Armenians, the exact same language that was spoken of about Jews. And I'm very concerned that the level of violence could go up drastically in this country, and that we have a president fanning the flames, and he's playing with matches, and he may burn down the whole forest in the process. So I hope to keep your optimism.
Well, actually, you're absolutely right that what was traditionally considered the opposition, the more conservative element, there is no conservative element in this country anymore. There are different liberal sources. The conservative element has abandoned its own legitimacy by following Trump. And,
yes,
even financially, the unbelievable deficit we have, thanks to Trump's, well, I'm just repeating what's obvious, it's
right.
It will come down really to the election in 2020. And one thing I was disappointed, there was mentioning of Trump in the Democratic debates. It wasn't brought out enough. The difference between Democrats, which are legitimate, was brought out, but that's not what they're facing. They're facing the change of American culture and values completely, which was mentioned occasionally, but not the profound effect which the election will have,
Right.
Well, thank you for
Charles,
listening to all this.
I appreciate it. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure the listeners have learned a lot. Thank you to your service to St. Louis and to journalism and sharing your life story. It's a very powerful one, and I feel we could talk forever, but we're going to cut it off here, and I hope to see you again in St. Louis, and
sure.
The best of health to you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I also want to apologize that you had such a long time getting a hold of me. There were so many things going on in my life, as you probably know. That
I know, and
I just
condolences.
couldn't find the time.
Yeah, condolences on life, on loss of your wife, and may remember be a blessing, and just I completely and totally understand that. So on behalf of producer Mark Lohr, St. Louis Speaks Podcast, that's it for now. Charles Klotzer, good talking to you, and see you all on the next episode of the St. Louis Speaks Podcast. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your interest.
All right,
and hope to meet you. Bye-bye.
And we will. Bye-bye.